Hi, I know I'm just a cat, but I believe in kindness. If you click subscribe under this video, you'll make my day.
You still playing CEO? Derek's voice rang out across the table, syrupy and loud, cutting straight through the noise of clinking forks and surface-level conversation like a bad joke no one really wanted to hear, but were too polite to ignore. His grin stretched wide, proud, smug, the kind of smirk someone wears when they think they've just nailed the punchline to a joke they've told 100 times before, and, for a moment, the table followed his lead, a few soft chuckles, some awkward shifting. My mother letting out that familiar brittle laugh she always used to patch over the cracks in the family. I didn't answer him right away. I didn't need to. That question wasn't a question. It was a performance. It was Derek doing what he always did, dressing up his insecurity in humor and serving it to the room like a side dish. But this time, the food wasn't the only thing that felt dry and overcooked. Grandma Ruth, sitting at the head of the table, didn't laugh. She didn't even smile. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward me, leaned in as if sharing a secret meant only for my ears, and whispered words that landed heavier than anything Derek had thrown at me in 20 years. "So you're the reason he's unemployed now?" Her voice was low, even, but in that moment it was louder than the rest of the room combined. The whole table froze. I mean it, you could feel the pause, the actual shift in the air, the kind of silence that doesn't happen on its own. My dad's hand hovered in midair with a piece of ham. My mom blinked like she wasn't sure if she'd heard right, and Derek, Mr. Wall Street, Mr. Corporate Alpha, suddenly looked like a man who'd just been stripped naked in front of his family. He blinked, scoffed softly like he wanted to brush it off, but the damage was already done. He turned toward Grandma, lips parted like he was about to say something clever, but no words came out. Not even a fake laugh. And I didn't flinch. I didn't explain. I just picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, letting it burn against the back of my throat like vodka. Because the truth was, I had waited for this moment, not planned it, not orchestrated it in the way he used to engineer my failures, but I'd imagined it, dreamed about it on those nights when sleep came heavy and bitter. The day the table turned. Every Easter was the same. Same ham. Same green bean casserole. Same stories. Same reminders that I had gone my own way, while Derek followed the more stable path. Every year he played the successful older brother, the one who bought a house in his early 30s, married a woman who hosted charity brunches and wore tennis skirts even though she didn't play tennis, drove a Tesla before Teslas were cool, talked about market volatility like it was the weather. And me? I was the oddball, the artsy one, the girl who built a wellness brand out of essential oils and handmade soaps and had the audacity to call herself a CEO even though I ran it out of a repurposed garage and paid myself barely enough to cover my rent. But what none of them knew, what Derek clearly hadn't figured out until that exact moment, was that the story had changed. The power had shifted. And Grandma, of all people, was the one to call it out. I could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on me, but I didn't look up. I let the silence breathe. Let them stew in it. Because this time, I wasn't going to explain myself. I wasn't going to downplay what I'd built or make a joke to smooth things over. I wasn't the same girl who used to beg for their approval. Derek tried to laugh again, but it came out flat, brittle. "What the hell's that supposed to mean, Grandma?" he asked, trying to recapture the room, to regain some footing. Grandma didn't look at him. She was still watching me. Her face was calm, but her eyes had that glint, that sharpness I remembered from when I was a kid, and she'd catch us lying about stealing cookies or breaking things and let us know, without raising her voice, that she already knew the truth. She had always been the quiet one, the observer, but never the fool. And in that moment, she was doing what no one else had ever done in this family. She was siding with me, publicly. "Just thinking out loud," she said softly, finally turning her gaze toward Derek, who looked like he'd swallowed a bone. "You know, funny how things come around." And, just like that, dinner resumed sort of. My dad cleared his throat and asked someone to pass the rolls. My mom mentioned something about the tulips starting to bloom early this year. But the energy was different. Like the room had shifted on its axis. Like everyone had just realized the hierarchy they'd clung to for years didn't quite make sense anymore. I didn't say a word for the rest of the meal, but I watched Derek out of the corner of my eye. He barely touched his plate. Didn't refill his wine. His knee bounced under the table, that old twitch he got when he was nervous. And for once, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel like the little sister trying to prove herself. I felt dangerous. And that's when it really hit me. Maybe this wasn't just karma. Maybe this was the beginning of something I had quietly set in motion a long time ago without even knowing it. Or maybe, deep down, I had known exactly what I was doing all along. You ever have a moment like that, where the one who always laughed at you suddenly realizes you're the one holding the cards now? Tell me, what would you do with that kind of power? Would you stay silent? Or would you twist the knife? Because me? I wasn't done yet. I suppose if you'd never lived it, you might think that siblings grow out of rivalry, that the things they said to each other as kids become meaningless echoes in the background of adulthood, softened and forgotten beneath mortgages, divorces, and the wear and tear of life that humbles everyone eventually. But in my family, rivalry wasn't just something we stumbled into, it was baked into the foundation, served up next to the mashed potatoes every holiday, passed down like some genetic curse wrapped in sarcasm and backhanded praise. And Derek? Derek didn't just play the role of the golden child, he wore it like a uniform, like he'd been born into it, and the rest of us were just extras in his show. When we were kids, people always said we made a funny pair, me with my books and notebooks full of scribbles, always building little worlds out of cardboard and glue, dreaming up stories about scented candles and natural skincare before wellness was even a thing people cared about, and Derek, tall and smug, always with a basketball under one arm and a smirk he'd inherited from our father, chasing numbers and trophies like affection came with a scoreboard. He laughed at my business plans when I was 12, tore up the flyers I made to promote my babysitting service, told me no one would pay to hear what a kid had to say about anything, and the worst part? The adults laughed too. Not because it was funny, but because they thought it was harmless. Boys tease. Brothers tease. That's just what they do. But he didn't stop. Even when we got older, even when I left for college and scraped together money from 2 part-time jobs just to afford a second-hand laptop so I could build my first website, Derek never saw it as ambition, he saw it as a joke. He came to my apartment once, uninvited, during the early days when I was blending oils and making bath bombs in my tiny kitchen, and he stood there looking around like he was in a third-world science lab, picked up one of my handmade labels, squinted at it, and said, "You know Etsy isn't the same thing as owning a company, right?" I laughed it off. That's what I did back then. I laughed. I minimized. I told myself he didn't mean it. But deep down, I knew better. I always did. The day I realized it wasn't just mockery, that he was actively trying to sabotage me, was the day I lost a partnership I'd spent 6 months building. It was a clean skincare brand run by 2 women in their 40s who believed in what I was doing, who saw potential in my passion and offered to invest. We were close, too close. I had signed a letter of intent. We were planning distribution. And then, one morning, they pulled out. No explanation. Just a cold email and a "we've decided to go in another direction." I was devastated, confused, and more than a little paranoid. It wasn't until a few months later, during a random industry mixer, that I heard the truth, that one of them had received a phone call from a concerned party warning them about my emotional volatility and unprofessional behavior. Someone who claimed to be looking out for them. At first, I thought it must have been a competitor, someone jealous or bitter. But then she said the man had introduced himself as my brother. I went cold. My mouth literally went dry. I remember leaving the venue early, walking 10 blocks in the rain without even realizing I'd left my coat behind. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat in my apartment, staring at my laptop, rereading that email over and over until the words blurred. And in that quiet, bitter stillness, something inside me shifted. I stopped needing to prove anything to him. I stopped trying to earn his respect. I started thinking differently, colder, sharper. I started making moves for myself, not for applause, not to win back something I should have never had to fight for in the first place. That was 5 years ago. Since then, I've learned how to play the long game. I built my company without his help, without the validation of the family who still whispered about whether I'd ever get a real job. I learned how to listen more than I spoke, how to read people, how to prepare my defenses before the first shot was fired. Derek taught me all of that, not intentionally, of course, but through his cruelty, his arrogance, his belief that I was too weak to ever retaliate. He never saw me coming. He still doesn't. And that brings us back to Easter. To the table. To the silence that followed Grandma's words. I saw something in Derek's face that day I hadn't seen in years. Not anger, not pity, not contempt. I saw fear. The kind that creeps in when the foundation you've built your identity on starts to crack. He didn't know what Grandma meant. Not exactly. But he knew something was wrong. He knew something had shifted. He knew I wasn't playing defense anymore. He didn't know how much I knew. And I hadn't even started playing my hand yet. There's a particular kind of silence that descends on a room when the truth starts to leak through the cracks, not fully exposed, not yet weaponized, but just visible enough to unsettle the ones who've spent years pretending everything's fine. And as I sat at that Easter table, chewing on a piece of cold, overcooked ham I didn't even taste, I realized that Derek had finally begun to feel it, that unfamiliar, uneasy shifting of the ground beneath his feet, that creeping sense that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as in control of the narrative as he'd always believed. And the irony? The delicious, quiet, devastating irony was that he had no idea I knew exactly what had happened to his job, because I had been the one holding the match, watching the gasoline soak into the wood, and waiting patiently for the moment he lit it himself. It had started innocuously, or at least that's what I told myself at the time. Just a bit of curiosity, mixed with the kind of paranoia you develop after years of being undermined and underestimated by someone who calls himself your brother, but treats your life like a stage for his own ego. I hadn't intended to dig into his affairs, not seriously anyway, but sometimes people slip up when they think they're untouchable, and Derek had always assumed he was just that, immune to consequences. Protected by the same arrogance that had once made him a rising star in finance and a household name in whatever country club circles he strutted through. It was a year ago, maybe a little less, when the first breadcrumb dropped into my lap. He'd shown up to a family dinner alone, tight-lipped, with that same sour expression he always wore when something wasn't going his way, but he couldn't admit it publicly. And while everyone else just assumed he was fighting with Rachel again or stressed over market shifts, I noticed the tremor in his hand when he picked up his wine glass, the way he checked his phone obsessively under the table, like he was waiting for something, dreading something, and in that moment, I knew something had cracked. I didn't act right away. I watched. I waited. I let the curiosity simmer until it turned into resolve. The truth unraveled slowly, but methodically, like pulling a loose thread on an old sweater, one tug at a time until the whole thing came undone. Through a few conversations with former colleagues of his, contacts I still had from networking events he thought I didn't belong at, I learned about his consulting firm. A fancy term he used to mask the fact that he was funneling company funds into a private account through shell vendors he himself created. It wasn't overt theft, not in the legal sense, not at first glance, but it was shady, unethical, and definitely fireable, especially for someone in a senior role whose firm was constantly under scrutiny for transparency. And here's the part that still makes me pause when I think about it. He tried to involve me. Last fall, during one of his rare attempts at being supportive, Derek invited me to lunch under the guise of discussing a potential collaboration, something about his firm wanting to invest in small wellness brands for social optics. It was bullshit from the start, but I played along, curious, suspicious. Over wine and overpriced salads, he laid out a vague pitch, full of buzzwords and smiles, describing a strategic partnership where I'd get funding and visibility, and well, that part was never clear. What was clear was the contract he sent me later that night, a mess of legal jargon with red flags blinking like sirens, clauses that would have given his company, and indirectly him, access to my customer data, my vendor lists, even partial ownership of my formulas. I didn't sign, of course. I didn't even reply. But I saved every email, every voicemail, every poorly veiled threat that followed when I didn't play ball. Because when you've grown up being gaslit by someone who insists they're joking every time they humiliate you, you learn not to confront directly, you learn to collect, to archive, to prepare. And when the opportunity finally came, when I heard, through a back channel, that his firm was undergoing an internal audit, I made a decision. I compiled everything. I removed my name from it, disguised the source, and sent it to the compliance team with one sentence: "You might want to take a look at this." I didn't think it would work. I thought they'd ignore it or sweep it under the rug like these companies usually do when the culprit's got the right handshake and the right watch. But something stuck. Someone saw the pattern. A month later, Derek was asked to resign quietly. The company issued no statement. His LinkedIn stayed vague. And our parents, clueless as always, believed his story about needing time to recalibrate. Now, as he sat across from me at that Easter table, his shoulders tense, his fork untouched, I could see it. He was starting to suspect. Not just that someone had set him up, but that it had been me. He kept stealing glances, trying to read my face, probably hoping to catch even a flicker of guilt or triumph or smugness, but I gave him nothing. Because the truth is, I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. I felt justified, tired. And maybe, deep down, still a little wounded that it had come to this. That he had pushed me so far, so many times, that revenge had started to feel like the only language he might understand. As dinner wound down and the family began their slow exodus from the table, Derek leaned over just enough to mutter, "Did you tell her something?" His voice was low, almost calm, but I could hear the tremor beneath it, the fear of losing not just his job, but his place, his image, his grip on the role he'd been performing for decades. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Because in that moment, we both knew he wasn't the one pulling strings anymore. And the worst part for him? He had no idea just how many more I still held in my hand. It was strange, really, almost eerie, how the softest people in the room, the ones who spoke the least and watched the most, often held the most terrifying truths in their palms like pearls, waiting for the right moment to reveal them, not for chaos or cruelty, but for clarity, for the raw unveiling of what had always been there, just beneath the surface, ignored by those too self-absorbed or arrogant to notice the weight of silence pressing in on them. That night, after the dinner plates had been cleared and the kitchen hummed with the low noise of half-hearted cleanup and passive-aggressive remarks between my mother and father about who should have remembered to buy more dinner rolls, I found myself walking slowly down the back hallway of the old house toward the room where Grandma Ruth had retreated, carrying with me a strange combination of anxiety and certainty, like a soldier going to meet a general who'd already fought the war years before I even realized there was one. The door was cracked open, just enough to let the amber hallway light spill across the faded carpet, and there she sat on the same floral armchair she'd owned for at least 30 years, her legs crossed, a paperback mystery novel in one hand and her reading glasses perched low on her nose, looking exactly like a woman who hadn't just turned the family dinner table into a courtroom with one whisper. She didn't look up when I stepped inside. She simply closed the book carefully, placed it on the side table next to her tea lukewarm now, and motioned toward the old ottoman in front of her, the one she used to rest her feet on when we were kids and she'd fall asleep during Wheel of Fortune. I sat down slowly, not because I didn't want to talk, but because I wasn't quite sure what I was walking into. There was something about her calm that unnerved me more than Derek's smirk ever had, because it wasn't cold or aloof, it was knowing. Purposeful. Controlled in a way that suggested she had seen this moment unfolding long before I had any idea I was even part of a game. "So," she said finally, her voice as even as ever, "you didn't lie." I didn't know what she meant at first. I blinked, the room suddenly feeling too small. About what? Her gaze lifted then, steady and sharp behind those cheap plastic frames, and in that moment, she looked more like a judge than a grandmother, wise, tired, and entirely unshaken by the storm she'd just dropped into the center of our family. "About him," she said, like that single syllable carried a history I hadn't even begun to understand. "About the way he treats you. The things he's done." I opened my mouth, closed it, then finally asked the only thing I really wanted to know. How long have you known? She leaned back slowly, as though the act of remembering required physical space. Years, she said. Long enough to watch you stop trying. Long enough to see you shrink a little every holiday, like you were wearing armor under your dress and waiting to get through dinner without being wounded. The lump in my throat wasn't grief, not exactly. It was recognition. And maybe a little anger at myself, at her, at everyone who'd let Derek's behavior pass as just part of his charm. Why didn't you say anything? She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You weren't ready to hear it. And he wasn't ready to face it. And I don't waste my words on people who haven't earned them. I stared at her, feeling the weight of something settle in my chest, something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice, the slow, painful, necessary kind that creeps in over time, not with drama, but with quiet, deliberate truth. She reached into the drawer of the side table then and pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed at the edges, and held it out to me. I rewrote my will last month, she said, flatly. Took Derek off it. I stared at the envelope like it might bite. Why are you telling me this? She gave me a long look, the kind that pierced through years of family dinners and forced smiles and birthday cards signed with love but no warmth. Because, she said, you're not like him. You think before you speak. You wait before you act. You don't humiliate people just because you can. And most importantly, you remember everything. I took the envelope, still sealed, still heavy with implication, and set it on my lap. Is this about the company? About what I did? She shook her head slowly. No, this is about what you didn't do. You could have burned him to the ground years ago, and instead, you built something. Quietly. With your own hands. He always needed a stage. You never did. Her words sank into me slowly, like hot tea on a sore throat, soothing and unsettling all at once. Because as much as I wanted to believe in her praise, I also knew that silence could be its own kind of cruelty. She could have stood up for me years ago. She could have stopped some of it. She didn't. Why no? I asked, the question heavier than I expected. Grandma Ruth leaned forward, her elbows resting on her knees, and looked at me like I was the last puzzle piece she'd been holding onto for decades. Because I knew you'd never ask for what you deserve, she said. So I decided to give it to you. The air between us stretched thin, taut with everything left unsaid. I looked down at the envelope, still unsure if it was a reward, a challenge, or a burden I hadn't asked for. And then she added, almost as an afterthought, funny thing is, I didn't have to push you to expose him. I just had to wait for you to realize he'd never stop. I stood up slowly, the envelope still clutched in my hand, my legs unsteady beneath me. You knew this would happen. She smiled faintly. No, darling. I hoped it would. I left the room without saying goodbye, not out of rudeness, but because I suddenly understood that goodbye wasn't the point. The point was that I wasn't alone in this anymore, and maybe never had been. But the strangest part was knowing Derek still didn't see any of it coming. Not Grandma's role. Not my resolve. Not the fact that the next move would be mine, and I still hadn't decided how far I was willing to go. The thing about final confrontations, the ones that simmer for decades beneath polite smiles and carefully folded napkins, is that when they finally arrive, they never look the way you expect them to, not dramatic, not cinematic. Not wrapped in shouting or tears or storming exits, but instead, they unfold slowly, deliberately, in the quiet of ordinary places where the walls have heard too many secrets and the floorboards know the weight of every betrayal that's ever happened within them. And so, when Derek showed up at my front door the following afternoon, not with rage in his eyes or a lawyer in tow, but with a plastic grocery bag in one hand and a look I'd never seen before, something between confusion, desperation, and the hollow ache of a man whose pride had finally turned against him, I knew that this was not going to be a battle fought with raised voices, but a reckoning that would slice deeper in its stillness. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood there, blinking against the sun like he hadn't slept, his usual swagger evaporated, and said, I brought you those dumb herbal teas you like. The ones with the weird names. I didn't say thank you. I didn't step aside. I just stared at him for a moment, studying the cracks in his face, the weight in his shoulders, and finally moved enough to let him pass, not because I forgave him, not because I wanted to hear him out, but because I needed to see how far he was willing to fall before he'd admit what he'd done. He walked into my living room slowly, like the furniture might accuse him of something, and sat on the edge of the couch, not relaxed, not comfortable, just perched there like a man who knew he was about to beg, but hadn't figured out how to start. I sat across from him, arms folded, waiting, not offering him a drink, not asking about Rachel or the mess he left behind at work, just letting the silence grow thick between us like smoke. Finally, he spoke, not with a demand, not with the deflection he was so good at, but with a question that caught me so off guard I almost laughed. "Why didn't you stop me?" At first, I thought he was joking, or trying to twist things to frame himself as a victim of my silence. But when I looked at him, really looked, I saw something I hadn't expected to find: sincerity, regret, and something else, too, something uglier, something he hadn't fully named yet, but it was there in the twitch of his jaw and the way his hands gripped the edge of the couch cushion. He wasn't asking why I hadn't stopped him from stealing or manipulating or sabotaging. He was asking why I'd let him walk so confidently into his own downfall without warning him that the ground was crumbling. And the answer, though cruel in its simplicity, felt like the only truth I had left to give him. "Because you wouldn't have listened," I said. "Because every time I tried to talk to you, every single time, I got mocked or belittled or treated like I was just playing dress up. You built your whole identity on being right. There was no room for truth in that." He flinched slightly, as if the words hit a nerve he'd been pretending didn't exist, and looked down at his hands, like maybe if he stared hard enough they'd explain how he'd ended up here. "I didn't think you had it in you," he muttered, "to do what you did." I tilted my head, watching him. "You mean to protect myself? Or to expose you?" He didn't answer right away. He just shook his head slowly, then looked up at me with eyes that were suddenly tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "You ruined me, Maggie." I wanted to laugh. I wanted to scream. I wanted to remind him of every moment he'd taken from me, every opportunity he'd crushed, every word he'd used as a weapon. But instead, I just said, "No. You ruined yourself. I just stopped helping you cover it up." He leaned back then, a slow exhale leaving his chest like he was deflating, like the weight of what he'd done was finally pressing into him in a way he couldn't ignore. We sat there for a long time in that quiet, the kind that only comes when two people finally understand that whatever existed between them before has been irrevocably changed, not broken, not shattered, but transformed into something neither of them quite recognizes. Eventually, he stood. No apology. No promises. Just a nod, a quiet acknowledgement that the rules had changed, that the power had shifted, and he no longer held the upper hand. As he walked to the door, he paused, turned slightly, and asked, "Did Grandma know everything?" I stared at him, the silence stretching once more, and replied, "She knew enough." He left without another word, and I didn't watch him go. I just sat there, listening to the echo of the door clicking shut, feeling both lighter and heavier all at once. And maybe that was the strangest part of it all, not the revenge, not the reveal, not the shifting of the family's balance, but the emptiness that followed. The hollow understanding that, even after everything, there were no clear winners, no clean endings, just a table full of people pretending to love each other while silently calculating who they could hurt before dessert. Later that night, I drove to Grandma Ruth's house. She was in the garden, kneeling beside her hydrangeas, wearing those awful floral gloves and humming some old hymn under her breath. I told her it was done. That he knew. That he probably wouldn't come back for a while. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she stood, wiped her hands on her apron, and looked at me with that same quiet power that had cracked our family open like an egg at Easter dinner. "Revenge," she said, "is a lot like pie. Best served cold, sure, but only if you bake it yourself." I smiled, not because it was funny, but because I finally understood. This hadn't been about winning. It had been about reclaiming space. About finally standing in the light after being told for years that your voice didn't matter. About letting someone fall, not because you pushed them, but because you stopped being their net. And still, even with everything laid bare, there was one question I couldn't quite answer, one thought that lingered in the quiet moments after the confrontation faded. Had I done what needed to be done? Or had I become exactly like the brother I'd spent my whole life trying not to be? The table would be set again next year. The wine would be poured. The same casserole passed. But it wouldn't be the same table. Not anymore. Because once the truth is spoken, it never really leaves, it just settles in, quietly, waiting, like a guest who doesn't need an invitation.